The forest at Rothmere had been forbidden for 11 years, and everyone in the village knew the reason, or believed they did, which in a place so small amounted to the same thing. They said the old countess had perished among those trees in a fire no one could properly explain, and that the earl's father, half mad with grief, had ordered the gates chained and the paths left to grow wild rather than let another soul wander where his wife had drawn her last breath. They said the present earl, cold and unmarried and rarely seen, kept the prohibition out of duty to a dead man's sorrow. They said a great many things about Rothmere Wood, and Linnet Hale, kneeling in the damp grass at its very edge with her basket half full of foxglove and campion, did not believe a single one of them enough to stay away. She told herself, as she always did, that she was not truly trespassing. The boundary was a low stone wall, more suggestion than barrier, crumbled in 3 places from years of neglect, and the wildflowers that grew richest and rarest grew just past it, where the sun still found the clearings, but no gardener's shears had touched the ground in over a decade. Mrs. Petrie at the apothecary paid good coin for foxglove, betony, and the little blue speedwell that would not grow anywhere else in the parish, and good coin was not a thing Linnet could afford to leave ungathered, not with her mother's cough deepening with every wet month, and the coal running low again. She did not know she was being watched. He had come to the wood as he always did in these grey mornings, before the house woke, and the letters began arriving, and his aunt began speaking of duty as though it were a debt collector standing at his door. He wore no signet ring today, no fine coat, only rough wool and mud-caked boots, the clothes of a man who worked the land rather than owned the county beneath it, and he had grown so accustomed to the disguise that he sometimes forgot, for whole grey hours at a time, that he was the Earl of Rothmere at all. It was the only forgetting he permitted himself. He saw her before she saw him, a slight figure bent low over the flowers with a concentration that struck him as strange in a girl he assumed had come to steal, and he watched her for longer than was proper, waiting for the greed he expected to show itself in her face. It did not come. She handled the blossoms as though they were things that mattered, cutting each stem with care rather than snatching handfuls, and when a rabbit broke from the undergrowth and startled her, she laughed softly at her own fright, instead of cursing the disturbance to her work. He stepped from the trees. "You're on Rothmere land," he said, in the plain, hard voice he used for gamekeepers and poachers, a voice that had never once been his own. She startled again, dropping 2 stems of foxglove into the mud, and looked up at him, with an expression that held no fear he could name, only irritation, as though he were an inconvenience rather than a threat. "I am aware of whose land it is," she said. "I have not touched a single deer, sir, nor a bird, nor anything that belongs to the Earl but these weeds. Nobody has troubled to want in 11 years. They are hardly weeds if a lady is on her knees for them." "I am no lady," she said, rising, brushing damp earth from her skirt with brisk, unembarrassed hands. "I am a woman who sells flowers to an apothecary so that her mother might have coal in November, and if that offends the Earl's ownership of ground he has not walked in a decade, then he is welcome to come and tell me so himself." She did not know, of course, that he had walked it every week since his father's death, that the wood was the one place in the whole of his inheritance where he was not watched, weighed and measured for a marriage that would save the estate's crumbling finances. She did not know that the man standing before her in a forester's coat owned the very trees around them, and the roof over her mother's coffin bed besides. She saw only a stern stranger, with hard eyes and mud on his boots, and something in her plain, unflinching defiance struck him harder than any calculated courtesy ever had. "You'd speak that way to the Earl's face?" he asked, and there was, though she could not have known it, something close to admiration buried beneath the roughness of his voice. "I'd speak that way to any man who begrudged a dying woman her coal," she said, and then, softer, as though she had said more than she meant to, she looked away toward the basket at her feet. "Forgive me. I've no quarrel with you personally. You're only doing as you're told, I expect, same as the rest of us." It was, he would think later, The single truest sentence anyone had spoken to him in a year. He should have sent her away that morning. He should have told her the rules of the wood in the flattest terms and watched her go, and never returned to that clearing at that hour again, because he was a man with obligations far heavier than his own curiosity, and curiosity was a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll not report you, this once." "How generous," she said, with a dryness that surprised a laugh out of him before he could stop it. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind he had not permitted himself since his mother's funeral. She looked at him properly then, as if the laugh had changed something in her accounting of him, and he saw her decide, in the space of a breath, that he was not dangerous, only tired, only a man doing work he had not chosen any more than she had chosen hers. She did not curtsy. She did not simper or flatter or angle for his good opinion the way every woman of his own circle did the moment they learned his title, because she did not know his title, and it was that ignorance, more than anything, that made her the first honest conversation he had had in longer than he could remember. "What's your name?" he asked, before he could think better of it. "Linnet Hale," she said. "And yours?" He gave her the name he had given the tenants and the poachers and the girls at the village well, who never looked twice at a forester when a fine carriage might pass. "Ashe," he said. "Julian Ashe." It was not, strictly, a lie. It was a splinter of the truth, small enough to slip past his own conscience, and he told himself, as he watched her gather her basket and turn back toward the wall, that it changed nothing, that she was a village girl he would forget by supper, that there was no harm in a single stolen conversation in a forbidden wood. He was wrong on every count, though it would be weeks before he let himself admit it. She returned to the wood 3 days later, not entirely by design, though she would spend a long while afterward pretending it had been coincidence rather than hope. The foxglove was thinner near the wall, and she told herself the deeper clearings simply held better stock, and if some small, foolish part of her also wondered whether the stern forester with the unexpected laugh might be there again, she did not examine that part too closely, because examining it would have required admitting that a girl in her position, with debts pressing and a mother failing, had no business wondering about any man at all. He was there. He did not pretend surprise, and neither, in the end, did she. "You're bold, Miss Hale," he said. "Returning to ground you've already been warned off. You said you'd not report me, this once. I took it as an invitation to test your word a second time." She met his eyes without flinching, though her heart beat harder than the moment warranted. "Was I mistaken?" "No," he said, and something in the quiet weight of the word told her he meant it in a way that reached beyond mere flowers. "You were not mistaken." They spoke that day of small things, the kind of small things that build a bridge without either party quite noticing the bridge is being built. He asked after her mother, and she told him, briefly, plainly, without the performance of suffering some women used to draw sympathy, that her father had been a country parson who died owing more than he ever earned, that her mother's lungs had never recovered from the winter of his death, that Linnet herself had learned which flowers fetched a fair price, and which an apothecary would cheat a girl on if she did not know better. She spoke of these hardships the way one speaks of weather, an inconvenience to be managed rather than mourned aloud, and he found himself listening with an attentiveness he rarely gave to anyone, including the physicians and solicitors and relations who filled his days with talk that mattered a great deal less. He, in turn, told her almost nothing true, and yet somehow nothing false either. He spoke of a family he served, of an estate heavy with expectation, of a father he had lost, and a mother he had lost before that, and he let her believe, because it was easier, and because some bruised part of him wanted, just once, to be pitied for his own grief rather than managed around it, that he was a servant of the house rather than its master. She offered him a gentleness she would never have offered an earl, a plain, unguarded sympathy that asked nothing in return, and it settled into him like warmth into a room that had been cold for a very long time. "You loved her," Linnet said, of the mother he described only in careful fragments. "Your mistress, I mean," The old countess. I did, he said, and did not correct the word mistress, because to correct it would have unravelled everything, and he was not yet willing to let it unravel. This wood was hers. She planted half of what grows wild here now. When she died, the family closed it rather than watch it grow untended, as though closing it might keep some part of her contained within the walls a little longer. That's a sad kind of love, Linnet said softly, locking a garden because you cannot bear to watch it live without her. He said nothing to that, because she had, without knowing it, named the precise wound he had carried for 11 years, and never once spoken aloud to another living soul. And the fact that a girl who believed him a servant had seen it so clearly frightened him more than any accusation his relations had ever made. They met again the following week, and the week after that, until the meetings ceased to be accident and became instead the quiet architecture around which both their days arranged themselves, though neither said so plainly. She brought him, once, a small posy of the speedwell she sold to Mrs. Petrie, insisting he take it as thanks for his silence on the matter of her trespassing, and he kept it pressed between the pages of his mother's old garden journal, long after the blossoms had dried to nothing, though he told himself repeatedly that this meant nothing at all. It meant everything, and he knew it, and that was precisely the trouble. There were mornings in those weeks when she brought her mending instead of her basket, sitting on the flat grey stone near the clearing's heart, while he worked at some small repair to a fence he did not truly need to mend, simply so that the excuse of labour might justify the length of his lingering. She told him, one such morning, of the year her father's debts had first come due, how the bailiffs had come to the parsonage with their careful, apologetic cruelty, cataloguing the furniture piece by piece, while her mother stood in the doorway with a face gone the colour of old linen. She told it plainly, without asking for pity, and he found that the plainness itself was what moved him most, because every woman of his own circle who had ever spoken to him of hardship had done so with an eye toward his reaction, watching to see what sympathy might be extracted from the telling. Linnet watched nothing. She simply spoke, and let the truth sit between them as it was, unadorned. "You must have hated him for it," Julian said. "Your father." "I did. For a time," she admitted. "And then I stopped, because hating a dead man is a great deal of effort spent on someone who can no longer feel the weight of it. And I had a mother to keep warm instead." She glanced at him sideways, a small, testing sort of look. "Do you hate your father? For the wood, I mean. For locking it away, rather than teaching you how to walk through grief instead of around it?" "Sometimes," he said, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "Mostly I pity him. He loved my mother so entirely that her absence emptied him out from the inside, and rather than let anyone see the emptiness, he built walls around it and called the walls devotion. I have spent a good portion of my own life terrified of becoming him." "You won't," Linnet said, with a certainty that startled them both. "How can you be so sure?" "Because a man who is becoming his father does not notice himself doing it," she said. "You notice. That noticing is the whole of the difference." He thought of that exchange often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin whose value he has not yet fully reckoned. And it was on one of those mornings, with autumn beginning to gild the edges of the wood, and the light falling low and gold through the beech leaves, that he first caught himself wanting, quite desperately, to tell her everything. He watched her cutting stems with her quick, careful hands, humming some half-remembered hymn beneath her breath, entirely unaware that the man beside her owned the ground she knelt upon and the very name by which the whole county knew authority, and the weight of the unspoken truth pressed against his chest like a held breath he no longer had the strength to keep holding. "Linnet," he began, and something in his voice must have carried more than he intended, because she looked up at once. Her humming stopped, her expression already softening toward whatever gravity she heard beneath his tone. "What is it?" He lost his nerve. He would think, afterward, of 100 different ways the conversation might have unfolded had he simply continued, had he said the words already gathering behind his teeth, But in that moment, the fear of watching her face change, of watching the easy trust she gave him curdle into the careful distance she would surely learn to offer an earl, proved stronger than his courage. "Nothing," he said, "only that I am glad of these mornings. More glad than I know how to properly say." "I'm glad of them too," she said, and the moment passed, gentle and unbroken, though he carried the weight of what he had not said back to the great house that evening, like a stone tucked beneath his ribs, and told himself, as he had told himself so many times already, that there would be another morning, a better one, in which the truth might come more easily. There was not in the end a better morning. There was only the slow accumulation of mornings exactly like it, each one adding its small weight to the lie, until the lie itself had grown too large and too settled to be moved, without bringing down everything built around it. Word of a wealthy earl's unmarried state travels faster and further than any village gossip, and it was not many weeks before Lady Beaumont, his aunt and the nearest thing he had, to a mother's voice remaining in his life, arrived at Rothmere with the particular briskness of a woman who considered sentiment an indulgence the family could no longer afford. "The roof over the west wing wants repair you cannot pay for," she told him over breakfast, without preamble, because preamble was another indulgence she had no patience for. "The tenant cottages want repair you cannot pay for. Your father left this estate groaning under debt he was too proud to speak of while he lived, and you have spent a year walking about in the woods, like a man who believes grief pays interest on a mortgage." "I am aware of the estate's finances, aunt." "Then you are aware that Lady Cordelia Fenwick brings £40,000, and a father eager to see his daughter a countess, and that a man in your position does not have the luxury of choosing sentiment over survival." She set down her cup with the precision of a woman closing an argument. "You will call on her this month. You will be seen to court her properly, and you will put an end to whatever it is that takes you into that wood at dawn 3 times a week. Because I have heard whispers, Julian, and whispers left untended become scandal soon enough." He did not deny the wood. He did not confirm it either. But the warning settled into him with the cold, precise weight of a door beginning to close, and he understood, for the first time with real clarity, that the world he had been born into was not going to permit the world he had built in secret with a flower seller's daughter to continue much longer unchallenged. Lady Cordelia Fenwick, when he was finally obliged to call upon her, proved exactly as his aunt had promised and exactly as he had feared. Beautiful in the practiced, glass-like way of a portrait rather than a person, clever in the particular manner of a woman who had learned that cleverness must be deployed sparingly around men who preferred not to notice it, and entirely, unmistakably aware of her own value on the marriage market, down to the last shilling of her dowry. She was not cruel. That, he would later admit, was almost the worst of it, for a cruel woman would have been easy to refuse. Cordelia was simply ambitious in the way the world had trained her to be, and she watched him across her mother's drawing room with the calculating patience of a woman accustomed to winning. "You seem distracted, my lord," she observed, halfway through a call that felt to him like an hour spent under water. "One might almost think your thoughts were elsewhere." "Forgive me," he said. "Estate matters weigh on me." "Estate matters," she repeated, with the faint, knowing curve of a smile that told him she did not believe the excuse for a moment, though she was far too well schooled to say so directly. "I do hope, my lord, that whatever occupies your mornings does not occupy them for very much longer. A countess likes to know her husband's habits before the wedding, not after." He left that call with the distinct, uncomfortable sense of having been measured and found not yet caught, and the wood, when he returned to it 2 mornings later, with his conscience heavier than it had any right to be, felt for the first time like a debt he was accruing, rather than a gift he was permitted to keep. Linnet noticed the change in him before he said a word of it. "You're troubled," she said, watching him from beneath the low branch where she had taken to sitting while she sorted her cuttings, a habit that had grown between them, without either quite deciding it should. "More than usual, I mean. You've a look about you like a man being pulled 2 directions at once. It is nothing you need trouble yourself over. That is precisely the sort of thing a man says when it is exactly the sort of thing I ought to trouble myself over?" She set down the flowers in her lap and looked at him with the steady, unflinching attention that had, over these past weeks, become the thing he found himself craving more than any comfort his own rank could purchase. "You needn't tell me. I've no claim on your confidences, Mr. Ashe, but don't insult me by pretending there's nothing there," he almost told her in that moment. The truth rose in his throat like something long swallowed finally demanding to be spoken, and he opened his mouth with every intention of saying, "I am not who you believe me to be. My name is not merely Ashe. This wood is not merely the house's but mine, and I have let you speak to me for weeks as though I were beneath the notice of the world that governs both our lives, when in truth I could alter the whole of your fortune with a single word to my solicitor." What came out instead was smaller, truer in its own quiet way, and no less costly for its restraint. "There is a woman my family wishes me to marry," he said, "for reasons that have nothing to do with affection and everything to do with debt." Something shifted in Linnet's face, quick and carefully hidden, gone almost before he could name it, though he recognized it anyway, because he had felt its twin rise in his own chest more than once these past weeks. "I see," she said, in a voice pitched carefully level. "And do you love her?" "No," he said, with a certainty that startled them both. "I scarcely know her." "Then perhaps," Linnet said, gathering her basket with hands that were not quite steady, "you had better learn to. Marriages built on duty have been built on less, and a man in your position does not have the luxury of choosing sentiment over survival." She used, without knowing it, almost the exact words his aunt had used against him days before, and hearing them fall from Linnet's mouth instead, struck him with a force he had not anticipated, because he understood, watching her walk the path back toward the crumbled wall with her spine held very straight, that she was giving him permission to leave her, and that the giving of it was costing her something she would never admit aloud. He did not go after her. He told himself it was wisdom. He told himself it was mercy, that a man engaged in courting one woman for the sake of an entire estate's survival had no right to chase after another through a forbidden wood merely because she had looked, for one unguarded moment, as though his answer had wounded her. He told himself a great many reasonable things on the walk back to the house, and none of them made the walk feel any less like leaving something behind that he would spend the rest of his life failing to recover. For 9 days he did not return to the wood. It was the longest 9 days he could remember living through, longer even than the week following his mother's death, because grief, he had learned once already, was at least a thing that eventually dulled, while this restless, gnawing awareness of an absence, shaped exactly like a flower seller's daughter, showed no sign of dulling at all. He called twice more on Cordelia Fenwick, sat through her mother's careful hospitality and her father's careful accounting of settlements and jointures, and found himself in the middle of a conversation about which church would suit a wedding of appropriate grandeur, thinking instead of Speedwell pressed between the pages of a dead woman's garden journal. He returned to the wood on the 10th morning because he could no longer convince himself he was strong enough not to. She was not there. He told himself she had simply chosen a different hour, a different clearing, that the absence meant nothing beyond ordinary chance, and he returned the following morning, and the one after that, until a full week had passed with the clearing standing empty, save for himself and his own restless, mounting dread. It was only when he made careful, roundabout inquiries in the village, inquiries a forester might plausibly make, he told himself, though he knew perfectly well an earl's curiosity dressed in rough wool was still an earl's curiosity, that he learned Mrs. Hale had taken seriously ill, a fever settling into lungs already weakened past bearing, and that Linnet had not left her mother's bedside in a week. He went to the cottage that same evening, still in his forester's clothes, telling himself the disguise was merely practical, though some more honest part of him understood he was not yet ready to surrender the one identity under which she had ever known him. The cottage was smaller than he had imagined, cleaner than its poverty had any right to allow, and Linnet answered his knock with the particular grey exhaustion of a woman who had not properly slept in days. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and he saw, beneath the exhaustion, something that might have been relief and might equally have been the ache of a wound reopening. "You've no business coming here," she said, though she did not close the door. "Your mother is ill." "She is dying," Linnet said, flat and terrible in its honesty, "and I have no coin left for the physician who might slow it, because I have spent every shilling I earned this month on coal and bread, and the apothecary will not extend further credit to a family already owing him from my father's time, and I do not know what I am meant to do beyond sit beside her and watch." He did not think. He acted, the way a man acts when the thing he loves is drowning and there is no time left for calculation, and he told her, plainly, that he would send the physician from the great house that very night, that the cost would be seen to, that she was not to trouble herself over the reckoning of it. "You cannot possibly afford," she began, and stopped, some new and terrible understanding beginning to gather behind her eyes. How would a forester afford to summon the Earl's own physician on an hour's notice? He should have answered honestly in that moment. He knew it even as the silence stretched, knew that this was the crossing he had been circling for weeks without the courage to make it plainly. What he said instead, low and urgent, was, "Please, let me help her. Ask me nothing tonight. Only let me help her, and I will explain everything after. I swear it." She was too exhausted, too frightened for her mother, to press him further, and she let him go, and within the hour, Rothmere's own physician arrived at the cottage door with a case of instruments and a bill that would be quietly settled by a source Linnet did not think to question in her relief, because relief, in that moment, mattered more than mystery. Mrs. Hale's fever broke 3 days later. Linnet would later understand precisely how narrow that margin had been, how easily grief might have claimed the outcome instead of gratitude, and it was that narrowness, more than anything, that made the discovery which followed so much harder to forgive. She learned the truth not from him, but from Lady Cordelia Fenwick, and the manner of its telling was, in its own careful way, a kind of cruelty designed to wound as deeply as possible. Cordelia had grown suspicious of the Earl's frequent, unexplained absences long before Linnet's mother fell ill, and a woman who intends to become a countess does not remain suspicious for long without acting upon it. She had her own coachman follow discreetly, had learned, through patient and unglamorous inquiry, the name of the cottage and the family within it, and she arrived at the Hale doorstep 3 days after Mrs. Hale's fever broke, with the particular smiling menace of a woman who has come not to threaten outright, but to inform, which is so very often the crueler weapon. "Miss Hale, I believe," Cordelia said, standing in the small doorway in silks entirely unsuited to a cottage floor, surveying the room with an expression that made plain, without a single unkind word, exactly how far beneath her she considered everything within it. "I thought it only proper that you know precisely whom you have been entertaining in that wood these past months. I should hate for you to continue in ignorance and embarrass yourself further than you already have." "I don't know what you mean," Linnet said, though something cold was already beginning to close around her heart. "Your forester," Cordelia said, with the faint, satisfied cruelty of a woman delivering a verdict she had long anticipated enjoying, "is Julian Ashworth, Earl of Rothmere. The very man whose physician you were so grateful to receive, I understand. The very man I am to marry within the year." She let the silence sit a moment, savoring it. "I do wonder what he told you, to keep you so charmingly convinced he was nothing more than a servant. I wonder, too, whether you flattered yourself he might have meant any of it." Linnet did not remember Cordelia leaving. She remembered only the roaring silence that followed, the slow, sickening reassembly of every conversation she had ever had in that wood, every kindness, every near confession, every laugh she had thought unguarded, now recast beneath the terrible new light of what she now understood to be true. He had let her speak to him as an equal because he had known, the entire time, that she was not his equal at all, and that whatever tenderness had grown between them had grown in soil he alone had chosen to salt with a lie. She thought of the physician's bill. quietly settled by hands she had not thought to question. She thought of a man who could summon an earl's own doctor within the hour, and had asked her, in the same breath, to ask him nothing. She thought of Speedwell Prest, she now understood, not by a lonely forester, but by a man who owned half the county, and had chosen, for reasons she could not begin to forgive, to let a grieving, exhausted, desperate woman believe herself speaking freely to someone as powerless as herself. When he came to the cottage 2 days later, restored at last to his own name and his own fine coat, having resolved that the time for confession could not be delayed 1 hour longer, she would not let him pass the door. "You knew," she said, and her voice was terrible in its quietness, far worse than any shout could have been. "Every day, in that wood, you knew exactly who you were and exactly who I believed you to be, and you let me go on believing it." "Linnet, Miss Hale," she corrected, and the correction landed between them like a slammed gate. "I am not entitled to your Christian name, my lord, nor you to mine. I understand that now. I confess I did not understand it before, but Lady Cordelia was good enough to instruct me. I meant to tell you. I have meant to tell you for weeks. I could not find the courage, and then your mother fell ill, and I could not bear to add that weight to everything else you were carrying." "You could not find the courage," she repeated, and something in her broke and hardened simultaneously, a wound closing itself over with something colder than scar tissue. "I found the courage to speak plainly to a stranger in a forbidden wood about my father's debts and my mother's failing lungs, because I believed, foolishly, that we stood on some kind of equal ground. You let me believe that, my lord, while all the while you held every advantage a man of your rank could possess, and you tell me now that courage was the thing you lacked." She laughed, short and without any real humor in it. "I think you lacked nothing, sir, but honesty, and I do not know how to forgive a man for withholding the one thing that costs nothing to give." She closed the door. He stood on the step for a long while afterward, and the wood, when he returned to it that evening, out of some desperate, useless habit, felt for the first time in 11 years like exactly what his father had always intended it to be, a place sealed shut, around a grief too large to bear looking at directly. The weeks that followed were, for both of them, a slow and separate kind of suffering. Linnet returned to the flower selling with a grim, joyless efficiency, no longer venturing past the crumbled wall, no longer permitting herself even the small, foolish hope that had once made the gathering feel like something more than labor. Her mother, recovering slowly, watched her daughter's new hollowness with the particular helpless grief of a parent who suspects the cause but has not been told the whole of it, and did not press, because pressing had never been Mrs. Hale's way, though she noted, with quiet concern, how often Linnet's eyes drifted toward the tree line, and how quickly she looked away again whenever they did. Julian, for his part, discovered that a man could be surrounded by every material comfort his rank afforded and still feel, each night, as though he was standing in an empty room. He called on Cordelia Fenwick twice more, and both times found himself so plainly distracted, so evidently absent even while physically present, that Cordelia herself, sharp-eyed and unwilling to waste her considerable ambitions on a man whose heart so obviously belonged elsewhere, finally addressed the matter directly. "You are in love with someone else," she said, without preamble, over tea that had gone cold between them. "I have suspected it for some time, and I confess I no longer have the patience to pretend otherwise for the sake of good manners. Lady Cordelia, do not insult me with denial, my lord. I have built my whole life on reading a room correctly, and this particular room has told me everything I need to know for weeks." She set down her cup with the same brisk precision his aunt so often employed, though her eyes, when they met his, held something closer to weary sympathy than triumph. "I will not pretend the £40,000 means nothing to my family's prospects, but I have no wish to spend a lifetime married to a man whose gaze is permanently fixed on a cottage at the edge of a forbidden wood. Find another way to save your estate, my lord, or find another wife entirely. I release you from whatever understanding my father believes exists between us." It was, in its own unromantic way, an act of unexpected grace, and he told her so, plainly and with real gratitude, before riding home through the dusk with a heart lighter by one obligation and heavier by an entirely different weight, because releasing him from Cordelia solved nothing of the wound he had opened with Linnet, and he understood, with a clarity that had been building for weeks, that no amount of solvency would matter to him if he could not find some way to earn back the trust he had spent so carelessly. The chance came sooner than he expected, and in a form crueler than he could have devised himself. Lady Beaumont, informed of the broken match with Cordelia, and its cause by a source Julian never fully identified, though he suspected a servant's careless tongue, arrived at Rothmere in a fury that made her earlier briskness seem almost gentle by comparison. "A flower seller," she said. The word dropped like something distasteful she wished to be rid of. "You have thrown away £40,000 and an alliance that would have secured this family for a generation, for a girl who sells weeds to an apothecary. I have heard, Julian, that she has been seen trespassing on this land for months. I have heard, further, that she was observed accepting the services of this family's physician, under circumstances no respectable woman ought to have permitted. I do not know what you imagine yourself doing, but I intend to see the matter handled before it becomes the very scandal I warned you against." "You will not touch her," Julian said, and the flatness of his own voice surprised him, a certainty he had not known he possessed until the moment it was tested. "I have already sent word to the magistrate," his aunt said, entirely unmoved, informing him of repeated trespass on Rothmere land by a woman of no particular standing, and suggesting he might wish to make an example, given how persistently the Wood's prohibition has been flouted this year. "It is well within the family's rights, Julian, and I will not apologize for protecting this estate from a scandal of your own making." He rode for the cottage before his aunt had finished the sentence, understanding with a cold, fast clarity that there was no time left for careful apology, no time left for the slow rebuilding of trust he had imagined might unfold across weeks of patient, humble courtship. There was only this: a woman he loved, about to be publicly humiliated and possibly prosecuted for the crime of picking wildflowers on ground that had only ever been forbidden because a grieving family could not bear to watch it live without the woman who had planted it, and a debt of honesty he had not yet paid. He arrived to find the magistrate's man already at the cottage door, a thin, officious fellow reading from a paper with the flat, joyless authority of a man enjoying his errand rather more than he ought, informing a white-faced Linnet and her frightened, still weak mother that a formal complaint of persistent trespass had been lodged by the Rothmere estate, and that the matter would proceed to hearing unless the family could produce funds for a fine well beyond anything they possessed. "That complaint is withdrawn," Julian said, striding into the small yard with a voice that carried the particular unmistakable authority of a man who has stopped, entirely, pretending to be anyone other than himself. The magistrate's man blinked. "My lord, I was given to understand the complaint came from Lady Beaumont, on behalf of the estate." "The estate is mine," Julian said. "Its complaints are mine to withdraw, and I am withdrawing this one, entirely and permanently. Furthermore, you may inform whoever requires informing that Rothmere Wood is no longer forbidden ground to any soul in this parish, and has not been, in truth, for rather longer than my family has been willing to admit." The man departed with considerably more haste than he had arrived, and Julian turned at last to face Linnet, who stood in the cottage doorway with an expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief, her mother's hand gripped tight in her own. "You cannot simply arrive and undo it with a word," Linnet said, though her voice shook now, the anger fraying at its edges into something rawer beneath. "That is precisely the trouble, my lord. You have spent this whole acquaintance believing a word from you could undo whatever needed undoing, and it cannot. It could not undo the lie you told me for months. It cannot undo the humiliation your aunt just attempted to visit on my mother's very doorstep." "You're right," he said, and the simplicity of the admission seemed to catch her off guard more than any defense could have. It cannot undo any of that. I am not here to pretend it can. I am here because I have spent every day since you closed that door discovering precisely how little the rest of my life means if I cannot spend some part of it earning back what I lost with you. And I understand, entirely, that I may fail. I understand I may have already failed beyond repair, but I could not let another hour pass with you believing I valued my own comfort over your safety, because I have valued nothing in this world so highly as I have valued you, since long before I had the courage to say so honestly. I do not want your apology delivered in a magistrate's yard, with your aunt's man scarcely out of earshot, Linnet said, though the fury in her voice had already begun, treacherously, to soften into something more exhausted than angry. I do not want to be your redemption, my lord. I have spent enough of my life being useful to other people's purposes without becoming useful to your conscience besides. You are not my redemption, Julian said. You were never that. You are the first person who ever asked nothing of me, Linnet. Not my name, not my rank, not the settlement my hand might bring a struggling family, nothing but honesty, which I confess is the one thing I found hardest of all to give. I understand if that failure has cost me the whole of your regard. I do not come here today to demand it back. I come only because I could not bear the thought of your safety, or your mother's, resting on my aunt's cruelty 1 hour longer than I had the power to prevent. Mrs. Hale, watching from the doorway with the sharp, quiet perceptiveness of a woman who had buried a husband and nearly lost her own life, and had, in the process, lost her patience for unnecessary pride, said gently, Linnet, let the man finish. I do not deserve the ease of finishing, Julian said, before Linnet could answer. I deserve, I think, to stand here and account for every week I let you believe a lie, because you were owed the truth from the very first morning in that wood, and I withheld it not from courage's absence, as I claimed at your door, but from cowardice, pure and simple. I was afraid that the moment you knew my name, you would treat me as everyone else in my life treats me, with calculation and careful distance, and an eye toward what my rank might purchase them. I wanted, selfishly, to be known first as merely a man, before I was known as an earl, and I told myself that wanting such a small thing excused the lie it required. It did not excuse it. I understand that now. I am sorry, Linnet, more sorry than I have words to properly carry, and I have no right to ask for anything in return for that sorrow except the chance to prove it, slowly, for as long as you'll permit. The yard was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the crumbled wall, the wood stood open now for the first time in 11 years, its long locked gate hanging loose on rusted hinges, and Linnet found herself thinking, absurdly, of the first foxglove she had ever cut from its edge, and of a stern stranger's unexpected laugh, and of Speedwell, pressed between the pages of a journal she had never seen but somehow, from the way he spoke of his mother's garden, believed entirely. You opened the wood, she said finally, because it was easier, in that moment, than saying anything larger. I opened the wood, he agreed. It should never have been closed in the first place, I think. My father built a tomb around his grief and called it love, and I very nearly did the same with my rank, building walls around myself and calling the isolation dignity. You were the first person who ever made me want to walk out from behind those walls, rather than deeper into them. That does not erase the lie. No, he said. It does not. Nothing will erase it. I can only ask you to let me spend whatever time you'll grant me, proving that the man who laughed with you in that clearing, who listened to you speak of your father's debts and never once flinched from the plainness of your circumstances, who valued your honesty above every practiced courtesy Lady Cordelia Fenwick ever offered me, was never the disguise. He was the truest version of myself I have ever managed to be, and I would rather lose the whole of my inheritance than lose the chance to be that man with you again. Linnet was quiet for a long moment, her mother's hand still held tight in her own, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the flatness of fury and taken on something more exhausted, more honest, more dangerously close to hope than she had permitted herself in weeks. I do not know how to trust an earl, she said. I have spent my whole life watching men of rank decide what women like me are owed, and I have never once seen that decision made kindly. But I think, and here her voice caught, just slightly, I think I do know how to trust the man who sat with me in that wood, and never once made me feel small for my poverty. And if you can convince me those two men are truly the same, then perhaps I might find a way to forgive the rest. Then let me spend the time convincing you, Julian said, not with grand gestures, not with an earl's easy remedies, thrown at every difficulty like a coin at a beggar's feet, simply with time and honesty, for as long as it takes, in whatever form you'll allow it. She did not answer him fully that day, though she allowed him to walk with her to the wood's edge, and something in the quality of the silence between them, no longer strained but simply careful, suggested to both of them that an answer, however slow in coming, would eventually arrive. In the weeks that followed, Julian set himself to the slow, deliberate labor of proving what words alone could not. He did not visit with gifts, though his fortune could easily have purchased a dozen kinds of forgiveness. He understood, with a clarity that had cost him dearly to earn, that a woman who had been deceived by a man's rank would not be won back by a further display of it. Instead, he came on foot, as often as she permitted, dressed no differently than he had once dressed as Ashe the forester, and he brought nothing but his own attention, freely offered and never withdrawn, even on the evenings when Linnet had little patience left to spend on him. He mended the fence around Mrs. Hale's new cottage garden with his own hands, badly at first, well enough by the third attempt, and did not once mention that a dozen estate workers stood ready to do the labor in his stead, had he only asked. He sat with Mrs. Hale through the long, dull hours of an invalid's slow recovery, listening to her stories of Linnet as a girl, of a childhood spent chasing hens through a parsonage yard and reciting psalms badly to an indulgent father, and found in those stories a version of the woman he loved that deepened rather than diminished his regard. He asked Linnet's forgiveness only once, plainly, in the wood where he had first withheld the truth, and did not ask again, understanding that repeated apology so easily curdles into its own kind of pressure, a demand dressed as contrition. Word of the broken match with Lady Cordelia spread through the county within days, as such things always do, and with it spread a dozen competing rumors, some cruel, some merely curious, all of them circling the strange fact of an earl who had, by every account, chosen to court a flower seller's daughter with his own two hands rather than his title. Linnet bore the whispers with a steadiness that surprised even herself, in part because Julian had made plain, in word and action both, that he would defend her against any slight the county chose to offer, and in part because she found, turning the gossip over in quiet moments, that she no longer much cared what a room full of strangers thought of a match they did not understand. It was Mrs. Hale, in the end, who first noticed the change fully settle into her daughter, some 4 weeks into Julian's patient courting, remarking one evening, as Linnet returned from the wood with colour in her cheeks, that had not been there in months, "You've begun to look like yourself again." "I did not know I had stopped," Linnet said. "You stopped the day that woman came to our door," her mother said gently. "I did not press you on it, because grief wants its own time, but I have watched you carry something heavy these past weeks, and I confess, I am glad to see you setting it down." It arrived, in full, some 6 weeks later, in the very clearing where they had first spoken, on a morning bright enough that the whole wood seemed lit from within, foxglove and speedwell blooming thick along paths that villagers now walked freely, children laughing somewhere among the trees, where once only silence and grief had been permitted to live. Mrs. Hale, restored fully to health, and installed, at Linnet's insistence and Julian's genuine wish, in a cottage on Rothmere land, close enough to the great house that a physician might reach her within minutes rather than hours, had taken, in these 6 weeks, to watching her daughter's face each evening, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who recognized at last the particular light that only returns when a wound has finally been permitted to heal. Julian had not pressed. He had visited, plainly dressed and honestly named now, 3 times a week without fail, had spoken with Linnet of small things and large ones both, had answered every question she asked about his family, his estate, his years of grief, without once softening the truth to spare himself discomfort. He had, at her request, told her the whole history of the Wood's closing, of his father's inconsolable mourning, of the mother he had lost too young to properly remember, and in the telling, something in both of them had continued, slowly, to mend. "I have thought a great deal," Linnet said that morning, standing in the clearing with a basket of wildflowers she no longer needed to sell, gathered now simply for the pleasure of gathering, "about what you said, about the man in the wood being truer than the Earl in his fine coat. And what have you concluded?" "I have concluded," she said, and there was, for the first time in 6 weeks, something almost playful in her voice, "that I do not much care which coat you're wearing, so long as the man beneath it continues to be honest with me. I have concluded that I would rather love a flawed man who has learned the cost of his own dishonesty than a perfect stranger who never had cause to learn anything at all." She looked at him then, steady and open, in a way she had not permitted herself since Cordelia's cruel visit to her cottage door. "I have concluded, my lord, that I love you, and that I have loved you, foolishly and without permission, since long before I knew your name, and that knowing your name has changed the fact of the feeling not at all, however much it changed my trust in the man who withheld it." He crossed the clearing to her in 3 long strides and took her hands, flowers and all, in both of his own, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was, at last, nothing left that urgently needed saying, only a quiet, overwhelming relief that settled between them like sunlight finally reaching soil too long shadowed. "I love you," he said simply, "not the version of myself that hid behind a forester's coat, and not the version that stands to inherit a title, but whatever version of me you have taught me to become in between the two. I do not ask you to become a countess for my sake, Linnet Hale. I ask only that you allow me to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the honesty you offered me first. Then ask me properly," she said, laughing through something that was very close to tears, "for I find I have grown rather tired of half-truths, my lord, even the pretty ones." He knelt, right there among the foxglove and the speedwell his mother had planted, a lifetime before either of them was born, in the very clearing where a stern stranger had once told a flower seller's daughter she was on Rothmere land, and asked her, with no disguise left standing between them, to be his wife. She said yes before he had finished the whole of the sentence, and the wood, no longer forbidden, no longer a tomb built around a grief too heavy to name, seemed to Linnet, in that moment, to exhale around them both, as though it too had been waiting 11 long years for something at last worth growing toward the light. Their wedding, held the following spring in the small parish church, rather than the grand cathedral Lady Beaumont had once envisioned for a match with Cordelia Fenwick, was attended by half the village and every tenant on Rothmere land, and Mrs. Hale, seated in the front pew in a gown her daughter had chosen, rather than one dictated by fashion, wept openly through the entire ceremony without a shred of embarrassment. Lady Cordelia sent, unexpectedly, a gracious letter of congratulations, having found, in the months since her release from the Rothmere match, a genuine attachment of her own with a baronet whose steadiness suited her far better than Julian's divided heart ever could have. And Lady Beaumont, though she never fully softened toward the marriage, could not deny, watching her nephew's face across the wedding breakfast, that she had not seen him look so unguardedly happy since long before his mother's death. Julian had the old garden gate rehung properly that summer, its rusted hinges replaced, its wood repainted the pale green his mother had once favored, and beneath it he had a small plaque set into the stone wall, simple and unadorned, bearing only a handful of words. "This wood is open, as love ought always to be." Linnet kept her flower basket still, though she no longer needed the coin it once earned her, and on quiet mornings, long after they were married, she would still be found kneeling at the clearing's edge, cutting foxglove and speedwell with the same unhurried care she had always given them, while her husband, no longer disguised, no longer hiding behind any coat but his own honest name, watched her from beneath the trees his mother had planted, loving her exactly as plainly and exactly as completely as she had first taught him how to be loved. And in the village where once they had whispered of a forbidden wood and a grieving earl who kept its gates chained shut, they whispered now of something gentler, something that felt, to every young woman who heard the tale repeated by her mother's fire, like the very best kind of truth. That the Earl of Rothmere had fallen in love, not with a lady of fortune or a woman of rank, but with a flower seller's daughter who had looked at a stranger in a forbidden wood, and seen, before anyone else in the whole of the county had thought to look, exactly who he truly was.